Good afternoon. I would like to welcome all those who participate in this discussion today. It's about the bridging the divide, East-West divide in Europe after the coronavirus. And it is actually sort of a concluding event of a Carnegie project that has been going on for about 2 years. Experts from the East and the West met in various places to discuss remedies for this divide. Unfortunately, we fell victim to the coronavirus. We had to cancel the remaining schedule, and we have to resort for the final concluding session to a Zoom meeting. This project has been supported by the International Visegrad Fund. Now, I especially welcome the participants in the panel. I welcome Katarzyna Pisarska. She is the founder and director of the European Diplomatic Academy in Warsaw, and she's also the program director in the Warsaw Security Forum. And I welcome Márton Ugrósdy, who is the director of the Institute for Foreign Affairs and Trade in Budapest. We were also supposed to have Pierre Vimont, my dear colleague from Carnegie, with us. But unfortunately, at the last moment, he was asked by President Márton to accompany him on his trip to the Baltics. And for reasons that I can hardly understand, he decided that this was more important than participating in our discussion this afternoon. But I'm sure we will have very interesting points made here during the coming hour. I would like to structure the discussion in 3 parts. I think in the first part, I would like to discuss the questions, the current sort of analysis of where we are in the East-West divide. How important is it really? In a way, in the past years, this was sort of a ghost that came up with lots of articles written about it, and it disappeared again from the view for a while. So generally, I've come to the conclusion also on the basis of this project that there is obviously not sort of 2 camps, an Eastern and a Western camps with opposing views. This doesn't exist because the East is as heterogeneous as the West. The Baltic states have much more in common with the Nordic states than they have with Bulgaria and Romania. And Bulgaria and Romania probably have more to do with Spain than they have with Poland or the Czech Republic. Also, I found it very interesting if you look, for instance, at the Commission Single Market Scoreboard, which looks at the implementation of the acquis communautaire and at the number of infringement procedures, there are no differences between East and West. The countries are all over the place, basically. And I think there have been interesting studies also that show quite clearly that the productivity of the EU legislative process and the speed of decision-making has not been slowed down by the big enlargement of 2004 and 2007. So as such, sort of the 2 camps don't exist. But what does exist, of course, is a number of issues where some key players on either side are from the West and from the East. And I think some of these issues are very of great actuality. And I think that none is more so than the rule of law, where you have today the publication of the first rule of law report of the Commission, which I think very wisely and fairly deals with all 27 member states and actually identifies shortcomings in all these member states. But where it also, I think, it's clear that some parts of the EU have a bit more of a problem than others. There is no question about it. There's also the big question of the rule of law conditionality in the recovery fund, a very, very contentious issue where Germany has just made a proposal for an EU regulation which is being discussed, and both sides, the European Parliament on the one hand and Poland and Hungary have uttered sort of ultimatums that unless their concerns are adequately met, the whole recovery fund will be blocked. So this is something that is actually in the next days that the European Council and in the following weeks will receive a huge amount of attention. Then there is migration. not as controversial as it used to be in 2015-16. I think generally member states converged on a fairly restrictive attitude to migration. But the reactions to the Commission's recent proposal of last week still showed that there are dividing lines. I think the Visegrad countries traveled to Brussels immediately following the submission of the proposal, and I think their reception was not totally opposed. They didn't reject discussing the issue on that basis, but at the same time, I think they were quite critical and felt still this notion of burden sharing was not dealt with in an adequate way, that there was still sort of an element of the quota system there that they cannot live there. Another big divisive issue is clearly climate change. It's in principle something that all EU member states endorse, but of course the ambitions are very high. Climate neutrality by 2050, reduction by 55% of emissions until 2030. Clearly, particularly for Poland, this presents a very, very tough challenge. And so far, I think Poland has avoided really committed to these goals, and it will be a very, very difficult negotiation. Finally, I think I should also mention the conference on the future of Europe, where this is supposed to be a big reform process that will be launched in the coming weeks, probably still in the German presidency. It will run until the French presidency in 2022. It will be sort of very open discussion on reforms, probably also some proposals for treaty change. And again, I think in this context, you will have different attitudes with probably the most enthusiastic countries for deep reforms, more in the western part of the continent, and some of the more reluctant countries probably more among the Central and Eastern European states. So I would like to invite you first to comment a little bit about sort of the current state of affairs in these East-West divisions. How do you see where do you see the main points of contention? How do you see things moving? Can I start first with you, Katarzyna?
Yes, absolutely. Welcome, everybody. Thank you. It's a huge pleasure to be here. And thank you, Stefan, for this great introduction. Indeed, we have spent 2 years meeting, discussing both with experts, but also with ministries of foreign affairs of Central Europe, but also with experts from what we call the West of the EU. You know that I am very uncomfortable with this idea of this West-East divide. As you said, Stefan, I think the divide isn't really East-West. There's a huge variety of actors on a variety of issues. You talked about the Green Deal, migration, rule of law. You know, the situation in Vilnius is not the same as the situation in Warsaw. The situation in Budapest is not the same as in Bucharest. So I think I would not, I always felt uncomfortable with the framing of the West-East divide as such. Having said that, there are differences and there are major contentious points. You've mentioned some of them, but I think there's a holistic one that we sometimes tend to lose. And this holistic one is understanding of the concept, understanding of what the European Union really is, and what the role or place of member states in this in the structures is. And here I'm thinking about a concept that was crafted in Russia, Putin's Russia, sovereign democracy. I think the divide that we have right now, especially between Hungary and Poland, but not only, there's other countries also going into that direction, is the way we think about what is the role of the state inside of the European Union and what is the role of the European Union versus its member states. And this sovereign democracy concept, which says basically, you know, we are the hosts of our house. We decide what kind of rules we set. Nobody outside of our borders can tell us, you know, how to behave. Human rights, you know, we decide what they are. Certain international obligations can be breached if we think this is more, it meets more of our interest. This, of course, is a thinking that again is very well known in countries like Russia, Turkey, but has also touched a certain, found a certain understanding, especially among the governing parties of Poland and Hungary. And why is this a holistic concept? Because if you have such an approach, then actually rule of law, we decide what rule of law is, yes? And nobody can tell us how to interpret our own constitution. Migration, this is our house. Nobody can tell us what guests we bring in, or who do we, invite, who do we decide to host as refugees, asylum seekers, how much migrants, economic migrants do we take, and so on and so forth. And finally, even the Green Deal, although I'll be happy to speak more about this when it comes to Poland later on, even here, if we feel in the sovereign democracy concept that the Green Deal actually directly benefits us today, yes, economically, for health reasons and so on, that's all fine. But if it costs too much, there is no reason to follow it. And this logic is, of course, a very dangerous logic from a point of view of a liberal project that the European Union is. It's dangerous because it talks about, it talks in the language that's a very realist language, which had it been the primary language of the European integration, the European Union today would not exist. Because in the European Union, we do agree we are a community of certain values. These values inform our decisions. They make us trust each other. They make us want to build consensus, and so on and so forth. So again, I think if there is a divide at the moment, it is about understanding the world in this kind of, liberal democratic and sovereign democracy concept. And I would say, again, not bashing, any region, I think there are tendencies in other countries to see the world this way. Look at Trump America, yes. Look at the United Kingdom today. Although we all hope that these are just individual voices, we can see these very strong strands that actually led to Brexit. And we can go on. I think every country has these problems. In some, they are only more visible, and in Central Europe, they have come to the mainstream, among others because of the history. Yes, because of the fact that this is a region which has always been between the West, the realist West, and the liberal democratic East. And this kind of clash is visible here very strongly. I'll stop here and I'll be happy to come back to some of these ideas later in the discussion.
Thank you very much, Katarzyna. Basically, you say that all these divisions on various items have an underlying issue, and the underlying issue is a different attitude to national sovereignty, basically. In a way, it's understandable that after regaining sovereignty, after the collapse of the Soviet Empire, you feel reluctant to give it up, basically. So it's understandable. And it's also clear that the kind of Western European original concept of sharing sovereignty, which had a lot to do with the German-French relationship, is not something that comes sort of naturally to people from.
But Stefan, it's more than that. It's not only our unwillingness to give up sovereignty. I think that's how the government would explain this to you. Mm-hmm. I would add another layer. I think it's a distrust, a very strong distrust that anyone can actually save us, if you know what I mean. I mean, at the end of the day, if the EU falls apart, we'll be there alone. At the end of the day, the international liberal order may just go into shams and we will be there alone. So I think it's a way of looking at the world, just like realists do, seeing this as, as this time of peace, as a time that is only intermediate. And it will end eventually, and we will find ourselves where we started. Yes, between two big powers with diverging interests, in which we will be sandwiched. So I think this very pessimistic, non-idealistic way of looking at the world also informs these type of activities. So we have to remember it's also that. Oh, you're muted.
Yeah. Márton, do you agree with this analysis, or do you see things differently?
I agree and disagree at the same time, but I think that's pretty normal. I completely support Katarzyna's point about sovereignty becoming the most important question and a new political cleavage, if you want. So how we understand the role of the state? Absolutely, yes. And that has a lot to do with left and right ideologies, if you wish. But on the other hand, I think it's not bad. It's a painful process, but it's a necessary process to go through all these debates if we want to figure out what the EU will be. Whether it will be a true political union, which will lead to a better coordination of policies, politics to some extent if the European Parliament will become stronger, or whether it will remain something like a single market where certain goods and capital and people and others can move freely, but we do not pool our political sovereignty in a way which is not in our economic interest. And I see this as one of the major dividing lines between European governments, that whether it pays, if you wish, to pool our political sovereignty at the same time. And when we talk about migration, when we talk about the divisive issues of rule of law conditionality, what how the recovery fund should be spent, whether there should be something like the European minimum wage or the unconditional minimum wage, if I translate it correctly back to English. So if you talk about these ideas and proposals which have a higher ideological meaning, of course we have a debate. But I think that's normal because the EU became more and more political, especially after the Lisbon Treaty, and it's a sign of having a serious debate, which reminds us of the domestic political debates to a large extent when it comes to communication tools, when it comes to castigating the others, when it comes to constructing enemies. But I think it also shows to some extent that Central and Eastern European countries are also taking ownership of some European issues. Of course, those issues which can be exploited for internal politics as well. But for a long time, I don't think it would have made any sense for example, the Hungarian government to have a position on refugee camps in Greece. It was just too far away. It was below the radar. But now, if anything happens on the island of Lesbos, that's like headline news in Hungary as well. So at least that process is moving ahead. So my point here would be that having a political debate about political issues, in my opinion, is completely normal. And of course, we have to be aware of the extremities in both cases. Stefan, what you said about the sense of nationhood, I think that is very important. If you really look at the map of the Central and Eastern European countries, you would figure out that the only brief period of something like of an independence was the interwar period between 1920 and 1940 something, depending on where either Germany or the Soviet Union has invaded you. So the experience and that you can actually decide on your own fate, you can write your own laws, is not something that we are used to, and it's not something which is being given up easily because of that. I mean, Hungary has been waiting for 500 years to be able to legislate on its domestic issues once again, since the Turkish forces have defeated the Hungarian forces in 1526. So there's a great amount of time to be covered, and Poland had an even more troubled past with the partition of the country several times. So the feeling that people have control through their governments of their own fate is something new. And Katarzyna, you were absolutely right that this is a time of peace right now, which is also the time to experiment with these things, and we do not know for sure how long it will last. And I think that's partly the reason that governments are so keen on experimenting with that, because they also don't know that how long they will have the opportunity to do so, even though I'm quite sure that if you take domestic political considerations into account, and this will be my final point, maybe understanding that how these countries relate to the European Union and some common projects and some common ideas could be also better explored. Because right now, and this comes back to my first point, which is about the importance of political communication and taking political ownership of European issues, all of the EU affairs will be politicized. So whether it's the recovery fund, whether it's rule of law conditionality, migration, climate change, you name it, everything has another meaning, another dimension when it comes to domestic politics. And I see all of the EU member states government playing the EU card in their domestic dealings as they're struggling to stay on power or get to power. And final thought here is that as I was watching the run-up to the publication of the rule of law reports of the EU today, the Hungarian press has been covering this for the last week or so, and most of the Hungarian MEPs from both parties have weighed in. Many articles were published. So, you know, even what you think about rule of law conditionality has a lot to do with your self-identification with some of the Hungarian parties, regardless then what is the deeper meaning of what is happening at the moment.
Thank you very much, Márton. I think if you're right, then we are really in a lot of trouble, because here we have the fact of Brexit, basically, the one country, big traditional European country that shared this strong emphasis on national sovereignty. The UK is out. And it's interesting, since that happened, there is a lot of talk about European sovereignty. Macron started it, but Merkel has picked it up. And this notion of strategic autonomy, sovereignty, nobody quite knows exactly what is meant by this, but it's clearly gaining ground. There's also a feeling that in view of the ways of negative developments in the European neighborhood and the instability and the lack of leadership from the United States and the rather sort of aggressive attitudes in China, there is a need for Europe to come closer together, which runs exactly counter to your analysis that if we are in a good place at the moment, but there will be dark times again, and for the dark times, we have to basically rely only on ourselves. So that seems to point towards a increasing divergence between the Central European states and the rest. But I'm not sure, frankly, whether this attitude is shared among more of these countries. Because if you look, for instance, the countries that have joined the euro, the Baltic countries and Slovakia, they have shared an essential part of their sovereignty. So, and from that, I think, follows that they altogether can no longer take this sort of traditional view.
Yes, I mean, we spoke, and when I spoke about sovereign democracy, I was thinking mainly about Poland and Hungary. I think it has found fertile grounds because of the two countries' history. So a kind of, you know, feeling that in history we have played major roles at times as you know, semi-empires, big kingdoms, parts of you know, of even the Austrian-Hungarian Empire, and that really makes this kind of identity a bit stronger than it is the case of other countries in Central Europe. But there's also a certain irony here, because Central Europe, and especially Poland and Hungary, were no United Kingdom. We're not the Isles. We cannot allow ourselves for splendid isolation. So that basically means that we are very much, you know, in a place where you do not know what the end result will be. I do not foresee Poland exiting the European Union, or Hungary even exiting the European any time soon, because we simply cannot afford it. Not in terms of financial, yes, or the question of regional structural funds, but because of the political and security reasons that such an exit would entitle. And on top of that, I say it every time, but I think there's not enough of consciousness about this. 80% of Hungarians and Poles actually support membership in the European Union. Yes, so we're talking about the populations actually being happy to be part of the project, but seeing, you know, but it's much more the politicians that see the European Union as limiting their power, as limiting their ability to act within their own country, and thus finding reasons to attack the European Union. But without really having, you know, the ability to even reflect on leaving. Yes. I don't think that either Orbán or Jarosław Kaczyński have an exit on their agenda. Having said that, it doesn't mean that the exit would not come to life. Yes, if you spend enough of years and time convincing people that the European Union is the next Soviet Union, it's taking away your freedoms and it's taking away your sovereignty, and decisions are made in Brussels, and who knows who makes these decisions in Brussels, what is that council, what is that commission, who selects them, and so on. If you like with any lie, the more you tell it, the more it sinks in. And of course, there might be a moment in which significant parts of the populations might say, okay, but so why are we really part of the project? Especially in moments where we stop to be, we begin to be a net contributor also to the project. So that is a real danger. And I think that's a danger that's not taken in consideration by the ruling governments in Poland and Hungary. The rest, it's also a different picture. Again, as you said, I would treat the Baltic states much more in the Scandinavian sense. They will have different sensitivities. They're much smaller countries. They simply, cannot even imagine their place outside of the European Union for again, 100 of different reasons, from security, political, economic, and so on and so forth. So that is out of the question. But you also have Bulgaria and Romania, which are also newcomers, and it's going to be really hard it's hard for now to see how they're going to, their role of the European Union, which is so far pretty weak because they're relatively new, but they also have weak state structures. How will that role develop over time? So I think, as Mao Zedong said, it's too early to judge the French Revolution. And I think it's too early to judge, how Central Europe will develop under enough of pressure. That's my opinion, my private opinion. I think it has a large chance to become a liberal, open Western society. But it just takes more time to do so. But that requires pressure and examples, yes? And if the liberal world order, starting with the United States, will dissolve, then of course we will see exactly the reverse processes. So I think the future of democracy lays in Central Europe, lays as much in the hands of the people in Warsaw, Budapest, and Vilnius as it does with people in Washington and in Paris, and the way they will vote and the way they will defend their democracies if they're able to do that.
Thank you very much. Can I ask you about the rule of law, which is probably where the next big clash is coming? You have this big issue of the conditionality for the recovery fund, where there are big threats from the parliament blocking everything unless there's a strong mechanism, and from Hungary and Poland that there will not be a ratification of the own resources decision unless there is something that doesn't infringe on national sovereignty. Do you see somehow a compromise emerging on this issue? It's of course necessary, because if the recovery fund breaks down, cannot be implemented, I think the EU will face a very, very uncertain future. Márton, would you like to comment?
Yeah, Márton, please, and then I'll say something about that.
All right, thanks. First of all, reflecting on what Katarzyna said, I very much agree with your assessment that exiting is not an option for the CEE countries, and not only because we're not islands, but also because of the economic integration of these countries to the single market, and especially Germany, by the way. The political security concerns are there. Our experience, and by our, I mean all the CEE countries, when we tried to go it alone, it usually didn't end up well. So a sense of belonging to a larger bloc, whether it's political or military like NATO or economic like the EU, is very important. And I think if you look at the economic results of these countries, especially before the pandemic and the economic growth they have been recording, that is significantly due to the excess of the EU markets, not the structural funds and so on and so forth, but the simple fact that European companies also from the West were able to invest and use the economic opportunities that these countries were presenting. Of course, that's due to lower costs of labor and so on and so forth. So it's not a completely rosy picture, but everybody was better off as the result of the single market. Strategic autonomy is a good question. And after that, I'll get back to the original question that Stefan asked about the conditionality. This is an interesting one for me because last Monday, Prime Minister Orbán wrote a long article to one of the leading Hungarian dailies, and there he said that he would like to see more strategic autonomy from the EU side so we could take care of at least our own backyard, which is not the case at the moment, as we're seeing in the Caucasus at the moment, for example, or in Eastern Ukraine. Anything about the Crimea or even the Western Balkans, when you do not have a conflict on fire at the moment, but we cannot be sure that how long this will last, not even to mention the Mediterranean. So curiously enough, the Hungarian Prime Minister, who is being seen as someone who is not willing to pull the sovereignty of the country, would like to see more strategic autonomy on the European side, meaning pooling one of your most precious part of sovereignty, which is the use of military force, coordinated foreign policy, and so on and so forth. So I think it also has to do with the question whether you see the EU as something instrumental, which helps you to achieve your political and economic goals in your country, or you see it as a goal in itself, which some of my federalist friends tend to do from time to time. So maybe a realistic assessment of the opportunities right now could be very useful. And the conditionality on the recovery fund is a good question. And, you know, we always say that you cannot really find a compromise, and then the leaders emerge after 4 or 5 days of intense discussion with a result which is acceptable to everybody, because as we know, nothing is agreed until everything is agreed. And I'm quite sure that even this time there will be a compromise at the end. Question is that what the European Parliament will have to say about it, because on their side, once again, the domestic political considerations are coming back. So what I see is that the European Parliament is being used as a proxy arena for domestic political infighting, which is an interesting development in a sense that maybe this is not what the founding fathers were thinking about originally. They were envisioning something of an organization which might be able to address European issues on the European level. At least the Hungarian example suggests that this is not always the case. And for me, it's really interesting to see the European Parliament going after certain member states' government, because even if you find a compromise in the council, then you still have to get it through the parliament, which is not always that easy because of different political considerations. But I'm quite sure that there will be a compromise at the end, because this is how the EU works.
Mm-hmm. Katarzyna?
Well, you know, I mean, we've been living with the Article 7 for how long is it? 3 years already? And I have learned to actually analyze the entire rule of law situation and conditionality and Brussels actions and, you know, member states support for these actions only for one paradigm. Does it have any impact on the electorate in Poland? If it doesn't, it's irrelevant. I'm sorry, you know, to be so harsh, but from the point of view even of human rights activists, rule of law activists in Poland and so on, it's wonderful to hear that, you know, the arguments put forward here against a number of reforms done by this government are heard. I respect that immensely, but does it really have an impact on the electorate? And I have to say with a great sadness that it has none. So Article 7 is pretty much at the moment a question of debate among experts, people that associate themselves with what we call the three most important elements: democracy, rule of law, and human rights. And there's nothing more there. So when we talk about the new issue on the agenda, so the question about conditionality, rule of law, to financing, again, I will be able to judge it if I see that it has a true impact on how an average Pole perceives the actions of the government. And I don't know, you know, if there will be a very clear and strong, and I fear that is not going to be the case, relation between rule of law breaches and the amount of money that a given country receives, whatever that country is, whichever that country is, then I can imagine people starting to question the policies of their governments. Of course, some will back the governments and say, okay, we don't care, we don't want the money from Brussels, blah, blah, and so on. But some will say, okay, so what is it about? Like, really, you know, I'm not really following these reforms. Why is it such a big deal that somebody actually wants to stop some funding? There was a very short case, completely unrelated, partly unrelated, recently in the last few weeks, concerning LGBT zones. So there's a few cities in Poland. These are small little towns, actually, that decided to implement through their small councils, town councils, LGBT, anti-LGBT zones. So they say, we don't believe in the LGBT ideology and we're not going to allow it in our little town. And the European Commission very smartly declined these little towns money for small projects. These were not big money that they've asked for, but all the towns that had these laws would not be able to receive the grants from the Commission. The government stepped in and gave these towns twice the amount, showing them, but we support you, don't worry, it's not a problem, yes? But these were small amounts and a very micro issue. When you're talking about billions of euros, if you're talking about huge amounts of money, that's an argument that is much more difficult to make. That it's not really a problem. Rule of law is not really a problem. It does not affect you as a citizen. So really, let's see where we find ourselves in a few weeks or months with the conditionality and how, in fact, this is going to reach an average poll, how he or she is going to react if, in fact, the procedure is going to be put in place and executed, because that's also a very very far cry.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much. I think I agree with Márton that it's very likely that there will be a compromise in the end. And I'm very worried that it will be a very flawed compromise, open to very different interpretation and very hard to implement in practice. And it could simply open up a whole lot of very nasty debates in the future, which is ultimately not terribly productive. Personally, I've always thought that the rule of law was essential for the functioning of the internal market. The trust in judiciary is simply a condition for this to function, but probably the judiciary is the best judge of what's going on. So ultimately, if the European Court of Justice takes a somewhat more proactive attitude in looking at rule of law issues, I would think that is at least sort of in terms of logical and institutional terms, the best approach forward. I think the Commission itself cannot sort of be the judge of general rule of law infringements. That's obviously not its role. So I understand the German proposal more in the direction of looking more at the direct link between corruption and misuse of funds and rule of law issues rather than sort of something that is parallel to the Article 7 construction. So, but still, I think the risk is, I agree, there will be a compromise. The risk is going to be a bad compromise, I would say. Can I ask you, we have a question from a listener who asked, since Márton mentioned foreign policy, do you think the EU is ready to move to qualified majority voting in foreign affairs? If this change is implemented, what will be the consequences after the first controversial vote? Now, I think that we have, this is a very controversial issue. I think there are still quite a number of countries that are very resistant, but I wouldn't exclude that Germany and France start pushing very hard on this issue, because they will never be in the minority and they must get very upset about the kind of vetoes from Cyprus, from Greece, sometimes from Hungary and sometimes from Poland. Now, if Mr. Orban suddenly finds a role for the European Union in security policy in the backyard, do you think he would also be more open to its QMV in this area, or is that absolutely a no-go?
Well, I think if there will be a decision on this, unfortunately, most of the CE countries will be collateral damage, because obviously this will be decided among the big member states. And here I count Poland as a big member state, so they might be more influential in that. My concern with QMV in foreign policy would be that even the two big countries, Germany and France, are not united on most of the issues. If you think about Russia, if you think about China, if you think about the US, I do not really see such a position emerging that will satisfy Berlin and Paris at the same time, in a way that they could own it as a victory, in a way that they could say that, okay, I got what I wanted. Because, just to give you an example, right now we have the conflict between Azerbaijan and Armenia going on. It's a highly complex one. And I'm quite sure that the assessment of the situation is completely different in Paris than in Berlin. And then, what will be the position of the European Union then? I think if we think about the EU foreign policy as something of an instrument rather than a goal in itself, that, let's say, this would be a way to assert the power of the European Union, at least in its immediate neighborhood, especially in those areas where we have kinetic conflicts between regular and irregular armies. I wouldn't be surprised if even Hungary would be happy to contribute soldiers and equipment and funds for that, just as we did in Mali and the Central African Republic, Cyprus, Sinai, and so on and so forth. So I do not see this as a very far shot when it comes to tangible, achievable goals of, let's say, do something about the situation, not even in Syria, but let's say, okay, let's have it in Syria. But when it comes to the systemic challenges, like what role the US will play after maybe a second Trump presidency, or what's going to happen to Russia, or how we're going to deal with China, I do not see that kind of unanimity even in the big EU member states, because you have to think about the economic interests. You have to think about how member states governments are trying to negotiate special access to their companies to the Chinese domestic market. You have to think about what might be the role of raising the Xinjiang or the Hong Kong or the Tibet issue with the domestic electorates. So it's highly complicated, and I do not really see Central and Eastern European countries being so instrumental when it comes to forming EU foreign policy in these highly controversial questions. And once again, that brings us to my first point, which was that these are political questions which have to be decided in a political process. And we still have a big homework to do in that regard.
Thank you. Katarzyna?
Yes, well, I don't agree with Márton on one thing. The assessment of how much disagreement there is in foreign policy. I've been doing EU foreign policy for a living for 2 decades now. And I think that over these 2 decades, we have seen an incredible, unthinkable convergence of European foreign policies. If we were 10 years from now today, sitting here and talking about Russia, I can tell you that we would be on disagreement with every member state on a variety of issues, from the approach to the assessment of the Putin regime, to the closeness of these relations. And over time, not because of the EU, but more because of Russia's actions, we have actually grown closer. And the fact that we've been able to impose sanctions and prolong them every 6 months for 6 consecutive years and ongoing, I think shows an incredible coherence with an actor that is perceived so differently in Rome than it is in London, or it is in Warsaw, or it is in Lisbon. So that's number one. Second of all, we have a strategic withdrawal of the United States from Europe. That's a fact. Whether it's going to be Donald Trump administration number 2, or it's going to be Joe Biden, the Americans will not be back in the way we've got used to them being here. And that means that Europeans effectively, including Central Europeans who have been under this umbrella only for 3 decades, but these were 3 decades, are left alone to a variety of different issues. We're already a huge player in trade. There's no doubt about that, but we have, since 1950s, 60s, basically worked that position. And trade is also part of foreign policy today. However we look at it, yes, it's not a separate element. We have great instruments of development policies. We have great instruments on the question of actually being a trustworthy actor in the world. Yes, people and countries want to talk with the European Union as a whole, not with particular member states. They want to see the EU as an actor, a separate actor. So I think there's a lot of push and pull factors that are bringing this coherency of foreign policy. And if we're moving in that direction, then it's going to be natural to have some form of QMV in the decision-making process. And I would not oppose it at the end of the day. I think even Warsaw, if you would tell the current government today that a QMV would not allow Cyprus to block sanctions against Lukashenko, I think they would think twice, and I think because of the huge constellations of member states, I don't agree that all foreign policy decisions would be made between France and Germany. By the way, they don't have enough of votes to have the majority, and there's also blocking minorities and so on and so forth. It's really, at the end of the day, like with everything in the European Union, the question of trust. Because if we trust each other, then we can make this work. We can have a QMV. And then in situations that are really endangering, constructive abstention, yes, of an initiative that already exists. There's so many things we've already fought and implemented in the treaties that can be used here that would give the comfort of member states to be able not to take part in some kind of some of the initiatives. So for a QMV, definitely yes, but with the assumption that states feel safe enough and they have some kind of ability to constructively absent from it.
Thank you. Thanks. Márton, you wanted to react to this?
Yeah, just very quickly. I think as the EU, we are still afraid of being challenged because you have the migration crisis, you have the financial crisis, now you have the corona crisis. You always have some crisis going on. But what I see in the history of the EU is that it is remarkably resilient. So it was always able to react to these challenges and done things which were considered unimaginable before. This might apply to QMV in foreign policy as well. This might apply to how the Eurozone will be reformed. I mean, 2 years ago, nobody in Berlin would say that Germany will share its debt with France. And now we're there as part of the European Recovery Fund. So I would like to think about these challenges as something which will just may force us to get out of our comfort zones and finally do something which will get us ahead. And all these pains, all these challenges, all these problems we're facing at the moment will help us in move in that direction. So I remain positive about all these questions, regardless that obviously I see the problems at the same time.
Can I ask you something about the impact of COVID? Because it's quite interesting. On the one hand, this crisis has marked the return of the strong nation state. So particularly in the initial stages, it was really the state who was in charge. The internal market more or less disintegrated for a while. Schengen disappeared from the scene. It was the state who was back in charge. And in a way that comes back to your initial points about the role of national sovereignty and the understanding of the Central European countries as the state being really at the heart of the international system and a very sovereignist attitude to it. So that thinking probably was reinforced. Yeah. But on the other hand, if you take the recovery fund, which means a much stronger commission that probably has twice as much money as it normally has and has a very strong position vis-a-vis the countries that receiving funds, is the exact opposite. And that could lead, I think, to greater difficulties between some of the Central European countries and the Commission. So how do you see the impact of COVID on this?
I'm sorry to be repeating myself, but I think the jury's out, really, very much. In April, May, I mean, it was clear that there was a big disillusionment about the EU's role in COVID. I think it was unjust for the very reason that the European Union had so far very limited competences in healthcare. Member states have never assigned these competences, and there was not that much that the European Commission and the EU together could have done. But of course, we saw a lot of selfishness, yes, a lot of assuring that my state has all the necessary medical supplies and so on. And I think it was a very, very big lesson, like any crisis for the European Union, and kind of began a rethinking of the health care element of what we do together. But having said that, we now move into the area where the EU has an abundance of experience, which is, of course, getting out of financial crises. We've done that once, more or less successfully. You can have different judgments here, but clearly because of the Eurozone, the 19 countries that are so bound together that there is no way actually out. We have to do it together, or we just cause another financial disaster. The European Union will have a lot to say. The recovery fund is actually a very positive development in general, but I think an even more interesting thing that I've not predicted that it would happen anytime soon is the mutualization of debt. You can talk about the recovery fund as much as you want, and the money will come, will not come this year, next year. You know, there's a lot of technical issues. Hopefully they will. That's a huge thing because it's doubling the budget of the EU. But even more important for the integration processes is the fact that for the first time we decided to issue, you can call them Euro bonds, you know, to actually assure money for this recovery fund. And only far-right political parties in my parliament noticed this, and the big danger that comes with this danger in terms of for a national state, that it is the first step to a Hamiltonian union, to a federalization of the European Union. And I think it had a very there was a mixed address. It was addressed in a mixed way in our government, because on the one side, the governments are happy with the recovery fund, and Poland is going to be a big recipient of that fund, but it comes at the cost of larger European integration. Mm-hmm. So I don't think the nation state in Europe is the winner of COVID. I would again wait and see, has this not actually caused much more deeper intrinsic integration that will also make some of our countries like Poland and Hungary rethink the question of being part of the Eurozone, which we are not yet, but should be, and so on and so forth.
Many thanks. Márton?
I think we underestimate the approach of the CE countries when it comes to utilitarianism. So when it serves these governments' interests to have a more federalized solutions to certain issues, maybe the common and shared debt, they would be happy to jump the bandwagon, because if that benefits them politically and economically, I mean, that's the rational thing to do. But I think this is one of the reasons why it's so misleading to listen to the political fighting between the East and West all the time, because if we go a few levels deeper, if we think about the economic interests and the political interests in many cases, which comes out of the economic interest in these countries, we do not really find Central and Western European countries so far apart. A few words on how COVID impacted, in my opinion, the coordination with the EU. Obviously, when everybody was in panic mode in March and April, everybody just withdrawn to the usual and comfortable framework, which is the nation state. And you still had the borders, you could shut them down, and Austria shut down the border to Italy, and then France, and then Hungary shut down all the neighboring borders, and so on and so forth. But reopening was a bit more coordinated on the European level as the summer came, and people figured out that, all right, tourism is 10% of our GDP, so we should really do something about it to get people to Croatia and make German citizens move to Bulgaria.
There's still national decisions, basically, and it's very disorderly and confused, basically. So
yeah,
to coordinate this effectively on the European level so far.
Yeah, because we're getting back in panic mode because of the second wave. So I'm absolutely not surprised that everybody's getting back to this. But even as the European countries were shut down, I think three major phenomena emerged. First of all, the free movement of goods was preserved all the time. So people were not allowed to move across the borders, but industries were able to operate even in this highly unusual situation. Then second, there was a huge wave of returning citizens to the to the Eastern EU member states from the West. And somehow this was also organized, that hundreds of thousands of Romanians and Bulgarians have been passing through Hungary and Austria each and every day to get home, to be safe. And this connects to the third point, is that the division of labor within the EU, especially in unskilled and low-wage jobs, was laid bare finally. So there was Germany in April, and nobody was able to pick the asparagus from the fields because you did not have Romanian guest workers. And then German farmers have organized charter flights to bring Romanian squads who harvested the asparagus with the help of Eurowings with charter flights. So, you know, when it comes to the question that how CE countries are free riding on the EU, I think now we have the hardest evidence that yes, but we are contributing our labor force, which is also a significant factor. Final thought on that, in the relationship between Austria and Hungary, I think the Austrian government has requested the Hungarian government so that the healthcare workers who were commuting from Hungary to Austria should be led across the border so the Austrian healthcare system wouldn't stop to operate. And it happened because that was the interest of both parties.
Thank you very much. Finally, I think we're approaching the end of our discussion. Can I ask both of you to give me sort of one or two things that need to be done to improve the relationship? I think altogether our discussion was fairly hopeful. There are real issues. There are differences on some issues, but there is also a lot that brings the two parts of Europe together, basically. So what is your idea, Katarzyna, what needs to be done to improve the relationship?
You know, I think some of them, as Stefan, we've discussed so many times, come out of our common project. Yes, so we did see, and that was my impression, personal impression, that there's a very big distrust on the level of MFAs. You know, between Brussels and the MFAs. And I found that extremely surprising because I think after accession, and I'm talking here about Poland, there was this kind of amazement with Brussels, you know, what Brussels said, what the Commission said, everything is going to be, you know, then we should listen, let's do it. They tell us to do this. And this was a kind of mentality that of course was logical in the pre-accession process where you had to do your homework and get into the European Union. And then we started to change that approach, but instead of becoming a partner and a contributor, we kind of found ourselves in the defense. And I think when we talked with our MFAs, the feeling was that they were in defense all the time. So I think this kind of promoting mutual, you know, more of mutual discussions, cooperation. I think that's and political engagement between a variety of stakeholders in the capitals of Central Europe and Brussels would be extremely helpful. I also think that you know, there is a lot to do on this civil society platforms. I come from the NGO world, and I can assure you that there's much more movement between Central Europe and Eastern Europe. Yes, we have much more Ukrainians, Belarusians, Russians, Georgians, Armenians, you know, coming here naturally because they're interested, they aspire to us, absolutely. But I rarely ever meet any Portuguese or Italian, or unfortunately very little French. And I'm talking about both civil society organizations, NGOs, journalists, study visits. I mean, after so many years of membership in the European Union, you would assume there's much more going on between non-governmental stakeholders, and that's not at all the case. So I would start there if we need practicals.
Excellent. Márton?
very quickly, I think first of all, we gotta get used to the political nature of debate on the European level as well. This is gonna stick, and this is gonna stay with us. It's not nice, but it's necessary, just as it's necessary to have national level political debates. On the other hand, I think as we move ahead with the integration will be deepening, it will be more and more important for all the countries to look for likely alliances based on issues. So on fisheries, we might work with Ireland. On climate change, we might work with, Croatia, whatever. So just try to avoid thinking inside the box all the time that, okay, the Benelux countries always go together, because that might not be the case, or we might be the allies of them in certain issues. The final point is that Katarzyna mentioned that we've been on the defense for such a long time. Maybe if there will be a bit of an openness to our good ideas, which might emerge from time to time, let's don't rule that out. Maybe if those would be considered in a serious way and would be given a nice consideration, that could be helpful as well.
Many thanks to both of you. I think basically European reunification was not finalized in 2004 and 2007. It's an ongoing project, and it requires constant engagement and care from both sides, basically. All the best. Many thanks to all the listeners too. Bye-bye.